This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
Because what the confession means to say is really that it's not a composition as we would find it in nature, either a confusion or a multi-parted type of composition. And I think just they're really trying to avoid that mistake. And for that reason, their purposes are right. In fact, it's just a way of saying, let's just talk about hypostatic union and two perfect natures and not run the risk of confusing people with this language of composition.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well. Looking forward to getting down in the weeds a little bit with you today.
Yes, our listeners will not be surprised to learn that the idea for this episode came from James. Although I'm delighted to discuss it and to learn a little bit more about it, because we're going to deal with a particular question related to the person of Christ and the way in which some of our Reformed forebearers spoke about it, and maybe some ways they did it that might initially strike us as unusual. But I want to go all the way back before we get to these 17th century figures. I want to go all the way back to the Council of Chalcedon. And the Council of Chalcedon and the Chalcedonian formula, as it's often called, what was affirmed there is defines Christ as being one person, very important, existing in two distinct natures, divine, human. And then there's this very important phrase where it says that these two natures exist and are united together without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. So we're going to start there. And James, just briefly summarize the significance of that Chalcedonian formula.
It's really swatting down two major Christological heresies. The first one, when it says without change and without confusion, is a refutation of Eutychianism, in which Eutyches, who had been a 5th century figure in the church in Constantinople, had said that Christ was actually subsisting in one nature, not two, and that he was one nature from two natures, but the nature of the union of the two actually resulted in a third thing, in which the perfection of divinity and of humanity actually were dissolved. Mostly the humanity was sort of dissolved into the divinity, but the two natures being joined underwent a kind of change or mutation. Maybe not the illustration the early writers use is the way that if you mix honey and water, it's not really honey or water, which is it's a composition involving some kind of dissolution of the elements. That's the key. So they're really trying to hold off the Eutychian notion that divinity or humanity underwent any kind of alteration in coming together. So they were joined, but they weren't joined in a confusion, and that's really the language that Chalcedon emphasizes. No confusion or change. That's against Eutyches. On the other side, when they say without division or separation, they're rejecting Nestorius's slightly older heresy that, in fact, the two natures belong to two distinct persons, or arguably two distinct persons, one of whom was true God, one of whom was true man, and they teamed up together to become sort of the Christ team. And so by avoiding separation and division, they're rejecting Nestorianism. By rejecting confusion and change, they're rejecting Eutychianism. So this is the way the Orthodox are kind of marshaling the doctrine between two competing heretical alternatives. That's sort of where all that comes from.
And it's striking that at the center of it, they can't particularly explain how this works, but how it doesn't work.
Yeah, these are four negations without change, confusion, division, or separation. This is not an exhaustive statement on everything that must be said in our Christ talk. And what's interesting, and where I wanted us to explore today, was the language of composition, especially, is language that was used well before Chalcedon by the Chalcedonian adherents and long after Chalcedon, in which theologians called Christ a composite person. And what they meant by that was that in fact there were two natures that were joined to each other in his person, not modulating or dissolving each other. So whatever that is, it's not a confusion, but some joinings together confuse and some joinings together don't. And the language of composition is interesting because composition just simply means to place with, right? To posit, or to positum means to place. And then you would say com alio positum, with another placed, is how Alexander of Hales puts it in the 13th century. And then a composition just means a placing together with. And so it could actually, if the composition does not involve the dissolution of or alteration of those things being composed, then in fact it could just be another way of narrating hypostatic union.
Now it's tricky because we use the word composite, although you've discussed the etymology of it. We use the word composite as a kind of a combination, of blending. So if you have a composite metal, it's sort of two metals that are blended together. And that's not what they're saying, because that would involve confusion. So that's one problem. One problem is we sort of use and understand the word composite slightly differently. And then the second problem is that there have been some who have denied composition. And so try to walk us through why this language of composite person is legitimate and it fits with the Chalcedonian definition, and why some people see it as another species of confusion.
Yeah, well, and I want to throw in one other qualification on that. Even in compositions which are not confusions, that is to say, a placing with that doesn't result in the diminution or dissolution of the elements, still, there's also the problem of, even in compositions that aren't confusions, those compositions end up being compositions of parts.
Right.
And this also becomes a problem for Orthodox theology, or it could become a problem for Orthodox theology if not rightly qualified. Because if I say a composite, you might automatically think a composition of parts. The reason you can't say that in the Incarnation is you cannot have divinity functioning as a part of a whole, because then the whole, as they are, would have to be greater than the parts, and then you'd have to say that the hypostatic union was greater than divinity itself, which immediately finitizes divinity. It demotes divinity to the status of a fundamental part of a whole, which makes it inferior in being to the whole. And so it seems like if we're going to say that divinity is placed together with humanity, that if this is in fact a composition, it cannot be like a natural composition in which the components are also parts. And so you can kind of feel like, because people naturally think that composition is either involves confusion or parthood, either one of those dilemmas, maybe it would just be advisable to dispense with that language entirely.
Well, that was going to be my next question. If it involves so much possibility of misunderstanding and error, really, then what's the value of, why is it that some theologians that we rightly revere, Turretin, among others, use this word, still continue
Thomas
to talk about it?
Great
What's that?
congregation. Thomas Goodwin, the great congregationalist.
Thomas Goodwin, yep, that's right.
John Norton, a lesser-known New England congregationalist, all speak this way.
Right. So why sort of tinker with this language when it opens the door, at least in people's understanding of it, to either infer parts or confusion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna first give a quick answer, and then I'll read the Second London Confession, because it actually denies composition, and then say, why does it continue to hang around even in Reformed Jesus talk? So my first response would simply be to say, Jonathan, and you know this well, that almost any language that you use to characterize a mystery like the hypostatic union is going to involve careful qualification of your terms. The idea that the terms themselves unqualifiedly are self-evident is not necessarily the case. So even in the case of union, for instance, if you call it a hypostatic union, most writers, John Owen, Francis Turretin, John Norton, kind of all of them will actually give a whole catalog of different kinds of union that they don't mean. Unions that in other respects are, in fact, rightly called unions. So, like, for instance, they'll say the hypostatic union is not like the union of three persons in one nature. It's actually one person in two natures. So it's not like the Trinitarian union. It's not like the union of body and soul, which are actually two parts in a compound substance. It's not part relation union. They give this whole catalog of unions that this isn't when we talk about the hypostatic union. So I guess my first point would be, if union has to have 6 or 7 negations in order to function in our Jesus talk, then composition is no different. Meaning, if you're going to use the word composite, which Orthodox theologians do, the argument that, well, only in a heavily qualified way is that the right way to speak about Jesus, I guess I would say, well, the same is true of union. In a heavily qualified way, we say that this is a union. And it's a true union. It's a real union. It's just not like these other 6 or 7 kinds that you tend to think of. Those would be the wrong way to think of it. So that would be my first response. The second is this, that in the 17th century, it's interesting to me that English confessions, Westminster, Savoy, Second London, all add the denial of composition to Chalcedon's denials. So I'll give it to you how it appears in the Second London, which is just following those earlier confessions. There it says that I'll pick it up. It says, so that talking about the Incarnation, so that two whole, perfect, and distinct natures were inseparably joined together in one person. So you can hear the language of Chalcedon there. The inseparability of Chalcedon is picking up the without division, without separation against Nestorianism. Without conversion, composition, or confusion, picks up 2 of the other denials without change or confusion, both explicitly Chalcedonian, but it adds right in between them without composition. Which person is very God and very man, yet one Christ, the only mediator between God and man. And I think the reason that they add, I will just posit this, the reason that they added without composition is because people would think of a natural composition as either one involving confusion or parthood. And so I think that's why they added in there. Owen, when he's talking about this in volume 1 of the works on the glory of Christ, says that this is how some of the ancients used to speak. And then he cites Cyril of Alexandria, and he emphasizes that this language of Christ being a composite person is not unorthodox. He's very clear about that. This is not unorthodox language, but he treats it as if it's arcane. He says, as some of the ancients used to say. What strikes me, Jonathan, is that in the 17th century, it's not just the ancients who spoke that way. It was actually many of Owen's own contemporary Reformed theologians, both in England and out. So, for instance, Francis Turretin still speaks that way. He's down in Geneva, contemporary of Owen. A little farther away across the water, John Norton in New England still speaks this way and gives a qualification for what we mean and don't mean. And then also, this is what really strikes me. His own contemporary Thomas Goodwin will still speak of Christ as a composite person in a couple of texts. And so while Owen says some of the ancients, like it's just a few ancient figures who spoke this way, it seems to sort of understate it. Actually, this is still a very contemporary way of speaking about the Incarnation, even in his own time.
But so that's a important and pretty interesting historical point, which certainly he would have been aware of. But the question then I would have is, what's the value in using it? What do you get? So you mentioned it, look, even using the word union has to be qualified, and that's right. But what does composite person give you, or what does it communicate that's true about the hypostatic union that we don't just get from the language hypostatic union? And let's deny composition because of all the potential baggage and misunderstanding.
I mean, a couple advantages besides simply just the fact that it puts your language sort of in sync with the traditional language. For all the defenders of Chalcedon, this was a very customary way of speaking. In fact, the Second Council of Constantinople says, he uses the word syntheton, or we get our word synthesis from it, that you're anathematized if you don't say syntheton or composite. So part of it is just the fact that you've got our confessions say he's without composition. You've also got Orthodox confessions and creeds. Also, the First Lateran says this, that if you don't say it, you're in error. So what's the advantage of it? Composition, to call Christ a composite person, has this advantage that the placing together with, which is really what it means, is actually a placing together with in his person. How's that different than union? It's not, in a certain sense, except that union is a little bit more generic, because you can talk about a unity of simplicity, for instance, in which there's no placing together with. Do you get what I'm after? So that the word union could indicate composition, a composite unity, or a simple unity, whereas composition definitely indicates a this and a that. Composition definitely indicates some sort of otherness. This is getting at that perfect Godhead, perfect manhood. Now, just so we're clear, I think our 17th century English confessions have us covered on that, because as soon as they say without composition, they immediately go on to say which person is very God and very man, and they even say right before that, two whole, perfect, and distinct natures. So they're definitely indicating the otherness of natures, the distinction of natures in the person of Christ incarnate. So they're not losing that. But composition, interestingly, actually requires it conceptually in a way that union alone does not exactly. And I think this is why the ancients and even the contemporary, even people who subscribe to the 17th century English confessions, are still in their theological works calling him a composite person. Here's why I think that they're not running afoul of their own confessions at that point. Because what the confession means to say is really that it's not a composition as we would find it in nature, either a confusion or a multi-parted type of composition. And I think just they're really trying to avoid that mistake. And for that reason, their purposes are right. In fact, it's just a way of saying, let's just talk about hypostatic union and two perfect natures and not run the risk of confusing people with this language of composition. I guess what I want to say, though, is, but then you would have to do the same thing with the language of union. You would have to explain all the kinds of union that it isn't. And so the challenge, I think, Jonathan, what got me thinking about this some years ago was subscribing to a confession that says without composition, and yet standing in a tradition with that confession that actually affirms composition, and feeling like this was some sort of unreconcilable tension. And I think it's not. Here's what I would say. We need to actually qualify what our 17th century English confessions mean when they say without composition. What they mean is without a natural composition resulting in multi-partedness that would demote the divine nature, or in dissolution or a change in one of the elements, that would be a confusion type of composition. And so I think as long as here's the question. You can say, well, you're going to have to qualify something. I have to qualify what I mean by union. I even have to qualify what I mean by hypostatic. If I say hypostatic union, I have to say not a union of persons, plural, but a union in person, singular. So even the word hypostatic union, you could imagine someone like a Nestorian saying, oh yeah, a union of persons, which is exactly what their heresy was teaching. So our word hypostatic will have to be qualified. Our word union will have to be qualified. The particular advantage of calling him a composite person is that composition includes the placing together with, it includes the plurality in itself conceptually in a way that union as such without qualification doesn't exactly. And I think that's probably why it was such a handy way of, on the one hand, rejecting Nestorianism by calling him a composite person, including both natures in one person. That easily kind of sort of dismisses Nestorianism. What you're going to have to do on the other side is just, if you're going to say a composite person and not fall into monophysitism, a kind of blending of the natures, then you're going to have to qualify what you mean by composition. And by the 13th century, that becomes a major project in which theologians are emphasizing at great length why this is not a composition of parts. And what's interesting is, in our own Reformed tradition, there's a sort of concerted effort to continue that 13th century qualification. This is a composition, but not of parts. And someone might say, well, aren't all compositions of parts? Not necessarily. It depends on what's being placed together, to use the language exactly. If one of the terms that's being placed together is the divine nature, and the divine nature could never be demoted to the inferior status of a part, whatever this placing together is, not only is it not a confusion, but it's also not a composition of parts. It's a togetherness, it's a union centered in the person. But this is very important. We don't want to think of the person as himself the product of the human nature and the divine nature coming together. So this is a composition that doesn't produce the unity of person as a consequence, because the unity of person actually precedes, so to speak, the composition or the placing together of the natures in hypostatic union. So all sorts of qualifications will have to come in, but can you say Christ is a simple person? Can you deny composition and then also, in the same tradition, affirm composition without being self-contradictory? And I guess I want to propose yes. And to our listeners who might read older Reformed theologians on this, maybe this at least puts in sort of a framework why they were so concerned to emphasize that he was a composite person but not one of parts, while at the same time subscribing to confessions that say the Incarnation was without composition.
Well, James, it's a fascinating discussion, and we may have lost some listeners along the way here, but we appreciate those of you who are here, and thank you for indulging us in this conversation, which is important to us, and I think has some significance as we try to understand the mystery of the Incarnation and even the heritage that we've been entrusted with. So, as always, we appreciate you as our listeners. We love hearing from you. If you're able to rate and review the podcast, that makes a big difference to us. It helps us. And if you want to pass this along to someone who might be interested, please do that. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.